After humiliating me for years, he finally told me to leave, but when I did, he realized I took more than just my freedom with me. My name is Martha Sullivan. I'm 69 years old, living in a quiet suburb of Richmond, Virginia, in a house that stopped feeling like home decades ago. For nearly 50 years, I've been Raymond Fletcher's wife, though. He's always preferred Ray with everyone but me. At 73, he's no longer running his small construction company, but retirement hasn't softened his dictatorial nature or his sharp tongue. I stand before the bathroom mirror, adjusting the worn blue scarf around my neck. The only gift Ray ever gave me during our first year of marriage, I wear it not as a cherished memento but out of habit. Like so many other things in this marriage, the fabric has long lost its original luster, much like the sparkle in my eyes that faded years ago. Tonight, our family has gathered at the main house to celebrate my grandson's 8th birthday. He's Abby's second boy, Abby being my daughter, a 45-year-old elementary school teacher who lives just a 15-minute drive away. I take one last look in the mirror, forcing a smile that doesn't reach my eyes, and head downstairs to join the festivities. The party starts off cheerful enough. Children's laughter fills our backyard, a sound so pure it momentarily drowns out the tension that perpetually hangs in our home. But even amid the celebration, I can feel Ray's scrutinizing gaze following me whenever I pass by, can hear his snide remarks just loud enough for me to catch. "Martha, those cupcakes look lopsided. Couldn't you have bought them from the bakery like normal grandmothers?" He says loud enough for my son-in-law's parents to hear. I pretend not to notice, focusing instead on arranging paper plates and napkins. It's a dance I've perfected over the decades. The art of invisibility in my own home. Ray keeps refilling his wine glass. Despite his age, his habit of drinking until inebriated and then verbally abusing me has never changed. I notice Abby shooting me worried glances each time Ray raises his voice with that familiar mocking tone. She's witnessed this all her life, and I see the same helplessness in her eyes that I've felt in my heart for years. As the evening progresses, Ray launches into an old story from when I was young. It's a memory I actually cherish, my first attempt at making a fancy dinner for his business partners, but he twists it beyond recognition. "You should have seen Martha back then," he announces to everyone, slurring slightly. "Tried to make beef Wellington and nearly burned down the kitchen. The guests were picking charcoal out of their teeth for days. I swear I don't know how I've endured nearly 50 years of this kind of incompetence." The in-laws chuckle uncomfortably. My grandchildren look confused. Abby's smile freezes on her face. We're all used to these moments of discomfort, but tonight, Ray doesn't stop at his usual humiliation. He rises unsteadily from his chair, wine glass held high, his voice slurred but deliberately cruel. "I think I've had enough," he declares, fixing his bloodshot eyes on me. "Look at you, Martha. Old, useless. What was the point of it all? I want a divorce. I need to enjoy whatever time I have left without dragging around this dead weight." The room falls silent. Abby clutches her son's hand tightly, her expression shifting from fear to helplessness. The in-laws lower their gazes, pretending not to hear, to avoid any involvement in what has become an excruciatingly uncomfortable scene. I don't react the way everyone expects. There are no tears, no pleading, no visible humiliation. I simply look at Ray, and for the first time in our marriage, my eyes are completely empty, devoid of any emotion, even hurt. The grandfather clock in the living room ticks loudly in the silence, each sound marking the moment I decide I won't endure another second of this life. Abby gently touches my hand under the table, silently asking what I'll do next, but I simply stand up and walk to the kitchen to clean up as if nothing happened. I methodically wrap leftover cake rinse dishes and wipe down counters while conversation in the dining room slowly, awkwardly resumes. Before the party ends, Ray throws one final barb my way as I pass through the living room with a garbage bag. "You should thank me for being patient with you all these years." I look up, meeting his eyes directly, something I rarely do, and offer a faint smile that surprises even myself. It's not a smile of submission or forgiveness, but one of revelation. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that tonight would be the last night I would ever set foot in this house as Mrs. Fletcher. That night, around 1 a.m., after Ray's drunken snores filled our bedroom, I quietly packed a few essential personal items. It wasn't for lack of possessions. I had a closet full of clothes and drawers of trinkets. But because I'd been preparing for this day for a long time, I waited until Ray's breathing settled into the deep, rhythmic pattern I knew so well after decades of lying next to him. Then I carefully lifted the loose floorboard under my side of the bed, revealing my small personal safe. Inside was a lease agreement for a small apartment in Richmond, along with an anonymous savings account booklet showing the money I'd squirreled away from craft sales and small sewing jobs I'd done behind Ray's back for the past 10 years. He never knew about the embroidery I sold at local craft fairs through Diana's booth, or the alterations I did for neighbors when Ray was out fishing with his buddies. "That's women's foolishness," he'd said once when he caught me hemming Mrs. Denton's curtains. "Not worth the thread you're wasting." But those worthless skills had built my escape fund dollar by dollar for years. I slipped out of the house silently without a goodbye note or a backward glance. The old Ford I'd purchased 6 months ago registered in Abby's name to prevent Ray from discovering it was waiting at the end of the block where I'd parked it earlier that evening, claiming I needed to borrow our neighbor's recipe book. 20 minutes later, I arrived at my apartment, my real home. Now I'd told Ray it was just a weekend retreat where I occasionally went for mental peace. A lie he accepted only because it massaged his ego that I needed to recover from the stress of living with him. In reality, it was the sanctuary I'd prepared after each time Ray crossed a line I swore would be the last. As dawn broke, I brewed myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, a small luxury Ray always complained was pretentious, and watched the sunrise through the third-floor window of my apartment. The feeling was strange, yet liberating, my first taste of freedom after nearly half a century of captivity. My phone buzzed continuously. I turned off Ray's calls and only answered when Abby's name flashed on the screen. Her voice cracked with emotion, almost breaking into tears. "Mom, where are you? Dad's furious. He says you took some money and disappeared. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I replied calmly, "and I'm not coming back." "What? Mom, what are you talking about?" Panic edged into her voice. "Everything is under control. Abby, I've been planning this for years." The line went silent for a moment before she whispered, "Years? But how? Where are you staying?" "I have my own place. Have had it for almost 2 years now." I could almost hear her worldview shifting through the phone, her perception of her submissive, helpless mother crumbling, as she realized I wasn't nearly as weak as she'd always believed. After reassuring Abby that I was safe, I pulled out Henderson and Blythe Law Firm's business card from my desk drawer, a small piece of cardstock I'd kept hidden for 6 months since Diana Brooks, my old friend from college, had slipped it to me after we ran into each other at the supermarket. "Just in case," she'd whispered while Ray was examining a display of bourbon a few aisles away. "This guy helped my sister when she left her husband after 30 years. I dialed the number and scheduled an appointment with Attorney Curtis for Thursday morning. As I hung up, I felt adrenaline coursing through my body, a sensation I thought was reserved only for the young. My hands trembled not from fear, but from exhilaration. That evening, I pulled out an old shoebox from under the bed. Inside were dozens of letters I'd written to myself over the years, documenting Ray's abuse, words of degradation, moments of humiliation, instances when his hand had gripped my arm too tightly. Letters I'd never sent because there was nowhere to send them. I took them to the small balcony and one by one set them aflame in a metal trash can. This wasn't about forgetting. It was about concluding an old chapter on my own terms. As the flames consumed the papers, I remembered Ray's dismissive words from years ago. A woman your age, where would you even go besides this house? Who would want you? The irony wasn't lost on me. Those very words had fueled my determination to escape all these years. Before going to bed, I picked up a book titled Rebirth: A New Dawn at Any Age, which I'd purchased 3 weeks ago but had hidden inside a cookbook cover, afraid Ray might see it. Tonight, I read it openly, treating it like a survival guide for my new life. But as I settled into what I thought was my perfectly controlled new beginning, something I hadn't anticipated began threatening the fragile freedom I'd just claimed. The peaceful quiet of my first days of freedom didn't last long. My small victory was quickly overshadowed by Ray Fletcher's looming presence. He wasn't about to let me slip away so easily. After I blocked his number, Ray began calling from various phones, friends' mobiles, payphones, even our neighbors' lines. Text messages arrived hourly, swinging wildly between threats and pleading in that manipulative pattern I'd grown accustomed to over decades of marriage. "You think you're so smart?" Martha read one message. Another stated coldly, "Nobody wants a lonely old woman like you." Then came the false remorse. "Baby, please come home. I didn't mean what I said." The next hour brought more venom. "You'll regret this when you're eating cat food alone." Following attorney Curtis's advice, I documented everything I purchased a second phone solely to preserve these messages and record any calls, evidence Curtis had said during our phone conversation. Every threat, every manipulation, will need it all. On Thursday morning, I entered the sleek offices of Henderson and Blythe Law Firm in downtown Richmond. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, directed me to a corner office with a view of the James River attorney Michael Curtis. A composed, sharp-featured man in his mid-50s greeted me with a firm handshake. His salt-and-pepper hair and reading glasses gave him an air of trustworthy authority that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, then caught himself. "Or would you prefer Ms. Sullivan?" "Miss Sullivan," I replied, the sound of my maiden name strange but welcome, after decades of being Mrs. Fletcher. For the next hour, I laid bare the story of my nearly half-century marriage, the subtle control that began during our honeymoon, the isolation that followed when Ray gradually cut me off from friends, the financial dependency he cultivated by insisting I quit my teaching job when we married, the verbal abuse that became so normal I stopped noticing it, and occasionally, the physical intimidation, not enough to leave lasting marks most times, but enough to instill fear. As I pulled out my documentation, the apartment lease, bank statements for my secret savings account, photographs of bruises I'd carefully dated and hidden over the years, and journal entries documenting the worst incidents, Curtis's professional demeanor briefly gave way to surprise. Most clients in your situation come to me with almost nothing," he remarked, examining the meticulous records. "You've essentially built your case already." "I've had years to prepare," I replied simply. Curtis explained Virginia's divorce laws, clearly outlining my rights to equitable distribution of property after such a long-term marriage. He assured me we had grounds for divorce based on cruelty and constructive desertion, meaning Ray's behavior essentially forced me from the home. "But I should warn you," he added, leaning forward, his expression serious. "Men like Ray don't surrender control easily, especially when it comes to dividing assets, the house, his pension investments. He'll fight for all of it." "I'm prepared to fight back," I said with a certainty that would have shocked the Martha of even 6 months ago. Over the next week, I gathered more evidence. The hardest part was asking Abby for her testimony. We met at a small cafe far from her neighborhood where none of Ray's friends might spot us. "Dad will be furious if he finds out," she whispered, fingers nervously shredding a napkin. "He'll be furious regardless," I replied. "But he can't hurt us anymore if we stand together." After witnessing my newfound resolve, Abby agreed to provide a written statement about the verbal abuse she'd witnessed throughout her childhood and adult life. For the first time since she was a little girl, my daughter was openly taking my side against her father. I also reconnected with Diana Brooks, who eagerly offered to testify about how Ray had systematically isolated me from friends, including her. She remembered specific incidents, birthday parties. I wasn't allowed to attend phone calls Ray had intercepted, even a weekend trip he'd canceled at the last minute, claiming I was too busy with housework when I'd been looking forward to it for months. One evening, about 2 weeks after leaving, I was reading in my apartment when the lights suddenly flickered. The weather outside was clear, no storm that might explain a power surge. A sense of unease crept up my spine. I moved to the window and carefully peered through a crack in the curtains. Across the street sat a black SUV I recognized instantly, Ray's Chevy Tahoe. My heart hammered against my ribs. How had he found this address I'd been so careful? Immediately, I turned off all the lights and moved silently through the darkness to the kitchen. The footsteps in the hallway came next. Heavy, deliberate, familiar. Then the soft sound of someone testing my doorknob, the slight jiggle of metal against metal cutting through the silence. I grabbed the kitchen knife I'd started keeping on the counter since Ray's threatening messages began. The weight of it was unfamiliar in my hand, but I gripped it firmly, backing away from the door. Memories flooded back. Ray looming over me during arguments, his face contorted with rage. Me cowering in corners, just trying to make myself smaller, less of a target. But tonight felt different. I wasn't that woman anymore. I pressed my ear against the door, listening intently. A whisper came through the wood, slithering into my apartment like a venomous snake. "Martha, open the door. You think you can hide forever." I held my breath, clutching the knife tightly, knowing that if this door opened, there would be no turning back. I immediately dialed 911, my fingers surprisingly steady. When the dispatcher answered, I spoke with a calmness that startled even me. "Someone is trying to break into my apartment. I believe it's my estranged husband who has been harassing me." My voice didn't quaver or break. After years of living in fear, it seemed I had finally developed an immunity to it. "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Can you safely move away from the door?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes, I'm in the kitchen. The door is locked, but he's trying the handle." The sound of the doorknob jiggling stopped abruptly. I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, but I remained frozen, knife in hand, afraid to let my guard down. For all I knew, he might be waiting, trying to trick me into opening the door. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. They found no one in the hallway or the parking lot, though Ray's SUV was also gone, but slipped under my door was a small piece of paper with a handwritten note. "Come home before it's too late." I handed the officers the note describing Ray's vehicle and explaining our situation. The younger officer took detailed notes, while the older one examined my door lock for signs of tampering. "Mrs. Fletcher, Sullivan." I corrected automatically. "I'm reverting to my maiden name, Ms. Sullivan." He nodded. "Based on what you've told us, I strongly recommend you file for a protective order. Given the documented pattern of harassment and this attempted break-in, you have good grounds." The next morning, I went straight to Attorney Curtis's office. When I showed him the police report and the note, his expression darkened. "This is serious. Martha Ray is escalating." He tapped his pen against his desk thoughtfully. "We'll file for an emergency protective order immediately and begin proceedings for a permanent one, but I'd also suggest upgrading your apartment security." That afternoon, a locksmith installed additional deadbolts, a door bar, and a peephole. With a wider angle, I also arranged for a security system with silent alarm capabilities, linked directly to the police department. Abby rushed over as soon as she heard about the incident. Her face was drawn with worry as she followed me through the apartment, checking windows and balcony doors. "Mom, please," she pleaded. "Come stay with us for a while. The kids would love having you, and David wouldn't mind." I took her hands in mine. No, sweetheart, I appreciate the offer, but I can't keep running. If I hide at your house, what then? Move to another state. Change my name. I need to stand my ground. Abby studied my face, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes that her mother wasn't the same submissive woman she'd known all her life. Her expression shifted from concern to something that looked remarkably like pride, mixed with lingering worry. "You've changed, Mom," she said softly. "I've remembered who I was." I corrected her with a smile. The next morning, seeking a way to manage my stress and regain some balance, I signed up for a senior yoga class at the community center near my apartment. The instructor, a gentle woman in her 60s, emphasized that yoga wasn't just about flexibility, but about finding inner strength. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. During my second class, I was arranging my mat when a familiar voice called my name. "Martha, Martha Sullivan, is that really you?" I looked up to see Diana Brooks, my old friend from college days, whom Ray had eventually forbidden me from seeing. Her auburn hair was now gray, but her bright green eyes still sparkled with the same warmth. I remembered Diana's surprise at seeing me quickly turn to understanding as we caught up over tea after class. I didn't need to explain much. She had witnessed enough of Ray's controlling behavior years ago to fill in the blanks. "You know," she said, stirring honey into her tea, "I manage the local library branch now. We could use a part-time assistant for the mornings. Nothing too demanding, but it would get you out of your apartment regularly and reconnect you with the community." The idea of working again after nearly 40 years as a housewife both terrified and thrilled me. "Do you really think I could do it?" "Martha, you organized the entire college yearbook committee while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. I think you can handle the return cart and help patrons find mystery novels," she said with a wink. I accepted her offer. The following Monday, I stood before my bathroom mirror in the simple navy blue blazer and khaki pants that made up the library's casual uniform. The woman staring back at me seemed decades younger than the one who had adjusted Ray's old gift scarf just weeks ago. That evening, returning home after my first day at work, a day filled with small victories and a sense of purpose. I'd forgotten. I noticed something off about my doorknob. There were tiny scratches around the keyhole, as though someone had tried to force it open. I checked the new security camera I'd had installed, but discovered the system had been temporarily disabled due to a localized power outage that afternoon. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Standing in my hallway, key suspended before the lock, I finally understood that Ray wouldn't stop until he dragged me back to my old cage. But this time I held the key to my freedom firmly in my hand, and I would not let it go. I stood in the classic literature section of the library, running my fingertips along the spines of leather-bound volumes, while Diana sorted through a cart of returns nearby. The familiar scent of old paper and binding glue filled my nostrils, a comforting aroma I had nearly forgotten in my half-lifetime away from these sanctuaries of knowledge. Diana had assigned me to oversee the classics section, knowing it was my passion. Since college, I smiled, recalling Ray's dismissive comments whenever he caught me reading Austen or Bronte, useless, dreamy nonsense that fills women's heads with ridiculous ideas. Later, my beloved books had mysteriously disappeared during spring cleaning, and Ray suggested I focus on practical reading like cookbooks and home decoration magazines. The library job provided more than just an escape from my apartment's solitude. It gave me purpose, a sense of contribution I hadn't experienced in decades. Patrons asked for my recommendations, thanked me for my help, and treated me with respect, rather than the pitying glances I'd become accustomed to as poor Martha Fletcher, always in Ray's shadow. "Miss Sullivan, could you help me find something by Steinbeck?" asked a college student, interrupting my thoughts. "Something less obvious than Grapes of Wrath." "Absolutely," I replied, leading him toward the S section. "Have you considered East of Eden or perhaps The Winter of Our Discontent?" These small interactions nourished my soul in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I began forging friendships with younger colleagues who valued my knowledge rather than dismissing me as just another elderly woman. Jessica, a tattooed librarian in her 30s, often invited me to staff lunches, insisting my stories about college in the 1970s were absolute gold. One evening, emboldened by my growing confidence, I joined a creative writing class at the local arts center. As I settled into a chair near the back, a deep voice spoke beside me. First time. I turned to see a tall man with silver hair and alert blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He extended his hand. Tom Weaver. Retired photographer, amateur wordsmith, and fellow late bloomer. Martha Sullivan, I replied, shaking his hand. And yes, first time. During the class, we were asked to write a short piece about transformation. As I scribbled about a bird finding an unlocked cage door, I noticed Tom glancing at my work. That's not fiction, is it? He asked afterward as we gathered our materials. I hesitated before answering honestly. No, not entirely. Over coffee at the cafe next door, Tom shared his own story of rebirth, how at 62 he'd walked away from a high-pressure corporate job to pursue his lifelong passion for photography. Most people thought I was having a midlife crisis about 2 decades too late. He chuckled. But it was the opposite. It wasn't a crisis, it was clarity. Tom and I fell into an easy friendship. Each week after class, we'd discuss our writing over coffee conversations flowing into topics I'd never dared explore during my life, with Ray, philosophy, politics, art, even our fears about aging. In Tom's company, I found myself laughing more, standing straighter, thinking deeper. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings dragged on deliberately. Attorney Curtis called with updates that consistently revealed Ray's tactics to delay and complicate matters. He's demanding you return to the marital home if you want any portion of the assets, Curtis explained during one call. He's claiming your apartment is illegally obtained, using his funds. I snorted in derision. Those funds were earned by both of us over 50 years. Exactly. And we have documentation of your contributions, plus the secret account you built independently. But he's trying every delay tactic possible. I countered by providing additional evidence of Ray's threatening behavior, the surveillance photos of the lock tampering incident from my building's security system testimony, from neighbors who had witnessed him lurking outside, and records of his continued harassment despite the temporary restraining order. One morning, about 6 weeks into my new life, I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. My hands trembled as I opened it at my kitchen table. Inside were photographs of me shelving books at the library, leaving my writing class, and most disturbingly sitting with Tom at our usual cafe, laughing over something he'd said. A small note accompanied the photos. I always know what you're doing. Don't forget who you are. A chill ran through me as I realized Ray wasn't just trying to control me financially. He was obsessed with maintaining his psychological grip even after I'd escaped. His message was clear. I couldn't have a life without his surveillance and approval. That afternoon, I made a decision. With Diana's encouragement, I wrote a personal essay about breaking free from decades of emotional captivity. Without naming Ray directly, I described the journey from submission to independence, carefully constructed to inspire other women trapped in toxic marriages, without exposing myself to legal repercussions for defamation. The Richmond Community Journal published my piece under the title, "Freedom at 70, It's Never Too Late to Begin Again." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emails flooded the paper's inbox, many from women sharing similar stories or thanking me for giving them hope. When Abby called after reading it, her voice trembled with emotion. "Mom, I've never been so proud," she said, barely containing tears. "You're not just saving yourself, you're saving others too." I was beginning to feel I'd gained the upper hand in this battle of wills between Ray and myself. My life was expanding daily while his seemed consumed by bitterness and vengeance. I was winning not by fighting him directly, but by simply living well. Then came the call from Curtis. Martha, we have a date for the final divorce settlement. Ray has one condition: he insists on your presence for the signing. He refuses to complete the process through respective attorneys as originally planned. My stomach tightened. Is that necessary? Legally, no, but strategically, it might be the fastest way to end this. Otherwise, he'll likely create more delays. As I hung up, I knew this would be the decisive confrontation, the final face-to-face battle in a war that had quietly raged for decades. On the morning of the divorce signing, I prepared myself more meticulously than I had for any event in years. I chose a deep teal dress with a modest neckline and hemline that fell just below my knees. The color brought out the green in my hazel eyes, eyes that now held a clarity and purpose, long absent. I polished my old leather pumps until they gleamed, applied light makeup, and secured my silver hair in a neat chignon. This careful preparation wasn't for Ray's benefit. It was my armor, my way of affirming to myself that I was walking into that room as an independent woman, not as the submissive wife who had spent decades shrinking herself to accommodate her husband's ego. Abby picked me up at 9, dressed in her teacher's attire, a simple blouse and slacks that somehow made her look both professional and supportive. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked as we sat in her car outside the law firm's building. "I've been ready for 20 years." I replied. "I just didn't know it until a few months ago." She squeezed my hand before we entered the Henderson and Blythe offices. Her eyes filled with equal parts worry and trust. We'd both been changed by these months, her discovering the strength in her mother, me, rediscovering the strength in myself. When we entered the conference room, Ray was already seated at the large mahogany table. I was struck by how diminished he appeared since I'd last seen him. His hair whiter, his face more deeply lined, his posture slightly stooped, but those cold eyes still held the familiar arrogance I knew so well, like a predator temporarily subdued but not defeated. His gaze traveled from my face down to my shoes and back again, unable to hide his surprise at the transformation before him. "Well, look at you playing the grand lady," he sneered, but I detected uncertainty beneath his mockery. "All dressed up for your big day of freedom." I responded with only a serene smile, denying him the angry reaction he sought. Attorney Curtis, who had risen when we entered, gestured for us to take our seats. "Let's proceed," he said, nodding to Ray's attorney, a thin man with nervous hands who hadn't bothered to introduce himself. For the next 40 minutes, Curtis meticulously reviewed the final settlement terms. The division of property, financial assets, retirement accounts, and personal possessions. Ray would keep the house, but I would receive substantial compensation for my share of its value. My secret savings account remained untouched as my separate property. When Curtis slid the final divorce decree across the table for signatures, Ray's hand suddenly covered the document. "Before we finish this," he said, his voice deceptively gentle, "I'd like a few minutes alone with my wife." "Ex-wife," Curtis corrected automatically. "Not until we sign," Ray replied, his eyes never leaving my face. Curtis and Abby both looked at me questioningly. I nodded my agreement. I had come too far to falter now, and whatever manipulation Ray had planned, I was prepared to face it head-on. 5 minutes. Curtis stated firmly, not a request. They left us in the conference room, though I noticed Curtis left the door slightly ajar, a precaution that would have touched me if I'd still been capable of fear where Ray was concerned. The moment we were alone, Ray's demeanor changed. The sneering hostility melted away, replaced by an expression I'd seen countless times, the charming penitent face he always wore after his worst behavior, the one that had kept me trapped for decades. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box and placed it on the table between us. Opening it, He revealed the pearl necklace he'd given me on our wedding day, a piece I'd assumed he'd discarded years ago after claiming it was too good for someone who couldn't even dress properly. "Remember when I put this around your neck?" His voice softened to the honeyed tone I once found irresistible. "You were so beautiful that day, Martha. Your eyes sparkled just like these pearls." I remained silent, watching this performance with a detachment that would have been impossible mere months ago. "I know I've made mistakes." He continued, reaching across the table but stopping short of touching my hand when I subtly withdrew it. "But seeing you like this, seeing how you've changed, it's made me realize how much I still need you." He leaned forward, eyes earnest. "I can change too, Martha. I promise. You can have more freedom. Join clubs, see friends. We could even travel. Just come home, keep our marriage. 50 years is too much to throw away." I listened without interruption, without the slightest flicker of emotion crossing my face. When he finally finished, I gently pushed the velvet box back toward him. "You don't need a wife, Ray," I said quietly. "You need a doll to manipulate." Unfortunately, I cut my strings a long time ago. His expression transformed instantly, charm evaporating into rage. He slammed his palm against the table. "You think you can survive out there alone?" he hissed. "You're nothing without me. Nothing. Who do you think would want a dried-up old woman like you?" I stood up, smoothing my dress with calm hands that no longer trembled in his presence. "I'm not just surviving, Ray," I replied evenly. "I'm finally living." I walked to the door and opened it fully, signaling our private discussion was over. Curtis and Abby returned, tension evident in their postures as they assessed the situation. Without another word, I took the pen Curtis offered and signed my name with decisive strokes on every marked line. Martha Sullivan, not Martha Fletcher. Each signature was both an ending and a beginning. Ray signed too, his pen pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. His face a mask of barely contained fury. He knew he'd lost not just the divorce proceedings, but the power he'd held over me for so long. As we left the building, I drew in a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. Despite the cold that penetrated my light coat, I felt invigorated. For the first time in nearly 50 years, I was completely free. Then, as I was about to step into Abby's waiting car, movement caught my eye. Ray stood at the edge of the parking lot watching me. The anger had drained from his face, replaced by something more calculated, more ominous. Our eyes locked for a brief moment, and I knew instinctively that while the papers were signed, the story between Ray Fletcher and me was far from over. As Abby drove us away from the Henderson and Blythe law firm, my initial sense of relief was quickly overshadowed by the memory of Ray's calculating gaze in the parking lot. His eyes had followed our car until we turned the corner, and now they seemed to follow me still, a phantom presence in the rearview mirror. "You're quiet, Mom," Abby noted, glancing at me with concern. "Just processing," I replied, my fingers absently tracing the edge of my purse where the signed divorce papers rested. Ray was in the parking lot watching us leave. Abby's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Should we call the police?" I shook my head slowly. "No. He's playing his final psychological game. The law has tied his hands, but he still wants to plant fear in my mind. It's the last power he thinks he has over me." As soon as I returned to my apartment, I called Attorney Curtis to report Ray's unsettling appearance. His response was measured but firm. "The restraining order is still in effect. Martha, document any contact or attempted contact. I suggest you remain especially vigilant for the next few weeks. Men like Ray often escalate when they realize their control is truly slipping away." Later that evening, Abby called with a proposition that I'd been anticipating. "Mom, David and I talked, and we think you should stay with us for a while. The kids would love having you, and we have the spare room already set up." I appreciated her concern, but my answer was ready. "Thank you, sweetheart, but no. If I hide at your house, I'd just be transferring my prison from one place to another. Besides, I won't risk making your family Ray's next target. Instead, I took proactive steps. Using a portion of my divorce settlement, I found a new apartment in an upscale residential complex with 24-hour security surveillance cameras and a doorman. It was smaller than my temporary apartment, but felt more like a home I could actually build a future in. Tom Weaver helped me move, showing up on Saturday morning with coffee and a practical approach to packing that came from his years of setting up photography equipment in remote locations, books in small boxes, kitchen items in medium ones, and never put heavy things on top of light things. He advised systematically wrapping my small collection of ceramics in newspaper. What I appreciated most about Tom's help was that he never positioned himself as my savior. He was simply a friend offering support while respecting my boundaries and decisions. He understood intrinsically what had taken me decades to learn, that true assistance empowers rather than controls. Once settled in my new home, I accepted Diana's offer of a full-time position at the library. What had started as a way to get out of my apartment had evolved into a genuine career revival. I developed programs to encourage senior reading, organized a monthly classics discussion group, and even started a gentle literacy initiative for adults who had never learned to read. "You're a natural at this," Diana commented one afternoon as we watched an elderly man proudly read his first complete paragraph aloud. "You're not just shelving books, you're changing lives." My own story continued to resonate within the community. The local women's center invited me to speak at their support group, sharing my journey of reclaiming freedom in the twilight years of life. The small meeting room was filled beyond capacity, many attendees clutching copies of my newspaper article dog-eared and highlighted. "I never thought it was possible to start over at 68. Confessed a woman with silver hair and tired eyes. "My husband says I'm too old to survive without him." "That's exactly what they want us to believe," I told her, recognition flashing between us. "But age doesn't determine courage." One evening, Tom and I were walking through the Riverside Park after dinner when my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. The words made my blood run cold. "I'm always watching you." I immediately contacted the police, who traced the message to a burner phone that couldn't be precisely tracked. While they couldn't prove it was Ray, the timing and content were enough to document another violation of the restraining order. "Record everything. Take screenshots, save any voicemails," the officer advised, "and be prepared for the possibility that he'll continue testing the boundaries until he faces real consequences." Later that night, Tom and I sat on my balcony watching the city lights reflect on the river. The evening had been tainted by Ray's message, but I refused to let it rob me of the simple pleasure of good company and conversation. "Martha," Tom said thoughtfully, swirling the last of his tea, "do you want to keep living your life looking over your shoulder, or do you want to move straight ahead?" The question stayed with me all night. By morning, I had reached a decision. I would not allow fear to dictate my choices anymore. For too long, Ray's phantom presence had loomed over every step forward I'd taken. It was time to confront that shadow directly. Not through confrontation with Ray himself, but by fully claiming my story. I proposed a small exhibition that would combine Tom's photography with my written narrative, a visual and textual testimony of transformation and freedom. Tom's images would capture the dignity of starting over, while my words would provide context and inspiration. "It won't just be about us," I explained to Tom as we planned. "It's for everyone who's ever felt trapped by circumstances they thought were permanent." The local arts center enthusiastically agreed to host what we called Late Bloomers Portraits of Renewal. We set the opening date for a Friday evening in early spring, a symbolic choice representing new beginnings. As preparations for the exhibition intensified, I felt increasingly empowered. Each photograph selected, each paragraph refined, was an act of reclamation. This wasn't just an art show, It was my declaration that I was no longer a victim. The day before the opening, a final envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. As I held it, I knew instinctively it was from Ray, and that whatever it contained would mark the end of a chapter. This time, however, I knew exactly how to close the book for good. I stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by the photographs and stories that made up our exhibition, Late Bloomers: Portraits of Renewal. Each image captured moments of rebirth from people who had broken free from their past constraints: a former executive who became a pottery artist at 65, a widow who started a community garden after 40 years of marriage, and others like me who had found courage in their later years. At the center of the display hung the photograph that had become the unofficial emblem of the exhibition, an image Tom had captured without my knowledge several weeks earlier. In it, I stood at the entrance of the library, laughing at something a young patron had said, my face illuminated with a joy I hadn't felt in decades. The photograph revealed a woman I was only now getting to know, strong, vibrant, and completely free. In my hand, I held the final envelope from Ray Fletcher that had arrived the day before I had opened it that morning, prepared for more threats or manipulation. Instead, I found just 3 handwritten words: I give up. I smiled, not from any sense of triumph over Ray, but from the realization that he had finally understood what I had known for months. There was no way to pull me back into the cage I had escaped. Attorney Curtis had called earlier to confirm that Ray had withdrawn all remaining complaints and petitions related to our divorce. He's terminated all legal connections, Curtis explained, and the police informed me he's left Virginia altogether. Apparently, he's moved to Florida to live with a distant cousin. It was over. The dark chapter that had consumed nearly 50 years of my life was finally closed. Mom, these photographs are incredible. Abby appeared at my side, her 2 boys orbiting around her like satellites, occasionally breaking away to examine the colorful art pieces scattered throughout the gallery. Her eyes shone with pride as she surveyed the crowded room. Look at all these people who came to see your story. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're living proof that it's never too late to start over." At a small table near the entrance, I signed copies of my newly published memoir, also titled Late Bloomers. The slender volume chronicled my journey from captivity to freedom, written in the evenings over the past few months, with encouragement from my writing group. The local publisher had initially printed just 500 copies, but they were already discussing a second run as interest grew. Women of all ages lined up for signatures, many sharing whispered confessions of their own struggles. Your story gave me courage to speak to a lawyer, one woman in her 50s murmured. My husband doesn't know yet, but I've been planning my escape for 3 months now. Diana Brooks approached as the signing ended, wrapping me in a warm embrace. I always knew you were a strong woman, Martha, she said. You just needed time to discover it yourself. The evening wound down as the last visitors departed. Tom approached with our coats. Ready for some fresh air? The sunset over the river should be spectacular tonight. We walked along the riverside path, the golden light of dusk painting everything in warm hues. The James River flowed beside us, constant and ever-changing, much like life itself. Tom stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the water. I've photographed hundreds of people throughout my career, he said, studying my profile. But I've never seen anyone illuminate themselves as brilliantly as you have. I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with genuine pride, because I've learned that the strongest light is the one you kindle yourself. Standing at the railing, I twisted the old wedding band I'd continued wearing out of habit even after leaving Ray. It had become less a symbol of marriage and more a reminder of what I'd overcome. With deliberate movements, I slipped it off my finger and tossed it into the river below. The tiny splash was barely perceptible, such a small ripple for an object that had once represented my entire world. This wasn't an act of hatred, but a ritual completion, a physical manifestation of letting go. Later that evening, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky. On the table inside lay an invitation from the National Women's Rights Foundation asking me to speak at their upcoming conference on empowering older women. My story, it seemed, was resonating beyond our small community. I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars. My heart felt peacefully full, anticipating not just tomorrow, but all the tomorrows stretching before me. At 70 years old, I hadn't merely survived, I had learned to truly live, and for the first time in my life, I understood with complete clarity that the path ahead belonged solely to me. This was more than just freedom from Ray Fletcher. It was victory over my own fears, over decades of conditioning that had taught me to be small, to be silent, to accept less than I deserved. I had finally broken the invisible chains that had bound me long after any physical ones could have been shattered. The night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the pot Tom had given me as an exhibition gift. Late bloomers, he'd said with a wink, are often the most fragrant. Standing there breathing in its sweet perfume, I knew he was right. This new life, hard won and begun in what some might call the twilight years, was all the more precious for the darkness that had preceded it, and it was entirely wonderfully mine.